An old man tied 3 helpless canine German Shepherd puppies to a tree. Then a soldier did something unthinkable. They were left to die. 3 German Shepherd puppies, barely old enough to walk, tied to a tree with a thin rope, abandoned under the scorching sun. No food, no water, no hope. People passed by. Some looked, some shook their heads, but no one stopped, until a soldier, home from deployment carrying invisible wounds, saw them, and what he did next changed everything. This story will restore your faith in second chances, in loyalty, and in the unbreakable bond between a warrior and the voiceless souls he chose to save. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. That helps us bring more inspiring stories like this one straight to your heart. It was the kind of heat that stole your breath. The dry, merciless blaze of late summer in a small rural town outside El Paso, Texas, the kind that cracked the earth and sent even the wild birds into hiding. But for the 3 tiny German Shepherd puppies tied to a mesquite tree on the edge of an overgrown lot, there was no place to hide. They were barely 6 weeks old, their paws too big for their fragile legs, their ears not yet fully standing. The oldest one, a dark-coated pup with curious eyes, let out a small yelp, not from one but from panic. His siblings, one a sandy brown and the other with a white patch on her chest, whimpered. In response, the ropes dug into their necks as they twisted, confused, hungry, and desperate for the mother who had vanished hours ago. The man who left them had not said a word. The old neighbor across the street watched from behind a curtain, shaking her head in silent disbelief. She had seen the man drive up in his rusty pickup, get out without urgency, and tie the 3 puppies to the tree. With a piece of worn rope, he had wiped sweat from his brow, looked around, and then got back in the truck and drove off. Just like that, she had called the local animal control, but no one answered, and deep down she didn't believe anyone would come in time. Not in a place like this, not for 3 unwanted dogs, but someone else was coming. Staff Sergeant Daniel Reyes had only been home for 12 days after 8 years in the Army and 2 deployments overseas. He had returned to his late father's property to settle the estate and maybe, just maybe, figure out what life looked like as a civilian. The small town held echoes of his childhood, but everything felt different now, quieter, emptier, like the part of him that used to belong here had been replaced by something harder, something scarred. That afternoon, Daniel was walking alone down the dirt road, his boots stirring up dust as he scanned the horizon. Out of habit. He hadn't meant to walk far, just enough to clear his mind from the constant pressure building in his chest. The silence used to soothe him now, it made his ears ring. That's when he heard it, a weak, broken yelp. Then another. At first, he thought it was in his head, another ghost of memory, but it came again, sharp. Real. He followed the sound across the lot, past a broken fence until he saw them, 3 puppies tied up, panting, barely moving. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. He rushed forward and dropped to his knees. The smell hit him first, a mix of sweat, dirt, and something worse, dehydration fear. The brown one was curled up, eyes glazed, barely conscious. The smallest one flinched at his shadow, but the oldest, the dark-coated one, tried to stand, growling. Weakly, Daniel's heart cracked. "Easy," he whispered. "I'm not going to hurt you." He pulled a small knife from his pocket and cut the ropes, careful not to startle them. One by one, the puppies collapsed into his arms, bones under fur, too light, too quiet. He opened his canteen and poured a small trickle of water into his hand, offering it to them gently. They drank, like they hadn't tasted anything in days. He looked around. Who would do this? His fist clenched as anger rose in his chest, hot and shaking. But more than that, he felt something deeper, something that pulled at a place inside him. he thought he'd buried with his uniform responsibility. He gathered the puppies into his arms, cradling them like broken pieces of something sacred. "You're coming with me," he murmured. "I've seen too much to walk away from this," as he walked back toward his truck. The smallest puppy lifted her head slightly, resting her chin on his wrist. Daniel didn't know it yet, but this wasn't just an act of rescue. It was the beginning of healing for them and for him. Daniel didn't have a plan. He'd never raised puppies before. The army had trained him to handle explosives, navigate hostile terrain, survive under fire, but not how to care for 3 trembling, malnourished puppies who looked up at him like he was their last hope. He brought them into his father's old garage, a space that still smelled like motor oil, sawdust, and faded memories. He cleared out a corner, laid down 2 old sleeping bags, and gently placed the pups inside. They were so light, too light, the smallest one. The one with the white patch on her chest was barely responsive. She whimpered every time Daniel moved, as if expecting pain. He knelt beside her, opening a can of wet dog food he'd picked up on the way back from town. "I don't even know your names," he whispered. He dipped his fingers into the food and brought it to the smallest pup's mouth. At first, she flinched, then slowly her tongue brushed against his fingers. Her tiny jaw worked weakly. Chewing, the other 2 followed the brown one, eating hungrily, and the dark-coated one never breaking eye contact with Daniel, even as he swallowed each bite. Daniel sat back against the wall and exhaled deeply. He hadn't realized how tense his own body had been. It was like something inside him had locked up ever since he got home, since the funeral. Since the silence, he looked down at the 3 pups curled together in the blanket. Now their bellies rising and falling, with slow, unsteady breaths. There was something fragile about it, something honest. Later that night, the smallest one began to cry, a thin, broken whimper that echoed through the garage and straight into Daniel's chest. He sat up instantly, heart pounding like it used to during night patrols. He moved toward them, instinctively checking them for signs of pain, injury, distress. She was shivering. He picked her up, gently, wrapping her in the corner of his hoodie and holding her against his chest. "It's okay," he murmured. "You're safe now, I promise." She quieted, and for the first time in months, so did his thoughts. The next morning, Daniel woke up, stiff, still sitting against the wall, the tiny white patched pup asleep in the crook of his arm. The other 2 were curled at his feet. He blinked against the sunlight streaming through the broken garage window. He hadn't planned to keep them. That wasn't the idea he had assumed. Once they were healthy enough, he'd call a rescue group or maybe someone from the base who knew about working dogs. These weren't just any dogs, he could tell by the way they moved, even weak as they were. Their bloodlines were strong. These were canine-bred German shepherds, likely from a litter meant for police or military work. Someone had paid a lot of money for them, and someone had still thrown them away. He couldn't understand it. Later that afternoon, Daniel brought the puppies into the house. For the first time, the place had been empty since his father passed. Dust-covered furniture, old coffee cups still on the counter, unopened mail piled high. It had never really been a home since Daniel's mother died. Years ago, his father had grown cold hard, like Daniel had over time, but as the pups explored the living room, tripping over their own paws, sniffing the legs of the table, and barking softly at their reflections in the fireplace glass, something began to shift. They brought warmth, noise, life. Daniel found himself laughing, an actual laugh, full and surprised when the brown one ran full speed into a laundry basket and flipped over. The dark-coated one barked in protest, then came to sit beside Daniel, tail essential, wagging eyes, sharp and full of something that felt eerily familiar. Focus, loyalty. Daniel reached down and stroked the pup's head. "You're trouble, aren't you?" he said. "But you've got fight." "I like that." He hadn't realized how empty he was until something filled the space, and it wasn't just the puppies who were healing something in him. Something broken and buried had started to stir, a beginning for all of them. 3 days had passed since Daniel brought the puppies into his father's house, and already it felt like something was shifting, not just in them, but in him. The smallest pup, whom he'd started calling Luna because of the white crescent patch on her chest, was finally eating. Without hesitation, the brown one, Rusty, followed him around everywhere, clumsy and loyal, and the dark one, bold, alert, almost too intelligent, had become Axel. Axel watched Daniel the way a soldier watches a commanding officer, with patience, awareness, and quiet expectation. That pup wasn't just smart, he was special that morning. Daniel sat on the porch, sipping black coffee while the 3 pups explored the yard. He had started building a little enclosure using leftover wood from the shed, something to keep them safe from the coyotes at night. He caught himself humming as he worked, something he hadn't done since before the war. Then a car slowed down on the dirt road. Daniel tensed instantly. Instincts kicking in, the old black sedan came to a stop right across from the driveway. The engine idled for a moment. Before the tinted window rolled down, a man leaned out, mid-60s, sharp eyes, hat pulled low. "You Reyes!" the man called out. Daniel stood, coffee mug still in hand. "Who's asking?" The man didn't smile. "Name's Griggs. You got some dogs here?" Daniel didn't answer. Griggs tilted his head. 3 pups, German shepherds, bred for canine service, valuable litter. "Why would I have them?" Daniel said slowly. Griggs didn't blink. "Because I was supposed to pick them up 4 days ago from a breeder named Connor Slate, but when I got to his place he said someone else took them. A friend said they'd gone to a better home." Daniel's jaw clenched. Connor Slate, that was the name on the mail he'd seen once or twice when his dad had gotten packages. His old man had dealt with breeders before, though Daniel never paid much attention. Griggs looked toward the yard. "That's your dog." Axel had stepped into view, standing at the edge of the porch, tail still, ears perked. "Nice form," Griggs muttered. "That one's got drive, they're just pups," Daniel replied, stepping forward. "Rescued from a ditch." Griggs' eyes narrowed. "You're not a civilian, are you?" Daniel stayed quiet. "I'm not looking for a fight," Griggs added. "But those dogs, they weren't dumped, they were hidden. That old man knew exactly what he was doing." Daniel's voice was calm but firm. "If that old man tied those puppies to a tree and left them to die, then he is not fit to own a goldfish, let alone a canine will litter." Griggs raised a brow. "You think that makes them yours?" Daniel stepped off the porch. "No, it makes them nobody's until someone who gives a damn shows up, which I did." There was a long silence. Then Griggs smiled, just barely. They got lucky before Daniel could respond. The man rolled up his window and drove off, kicking up dust behind him. Daniel stood there, heart pounding. Not from fear, but from something else, a realization. These puppies were more than abandoned. They were worth something. And now someone knew where they were that night. Daniel sat by the window, shotgun propped beside the door. The pups were asleep in their crate, peaceful, unaware. But Daniel didn't sleep. His mind raced with questions. Why would anyone want to hide them? Why leave them to die? And why did Axel, the pup, with the intense stare and military focus, look at him like he understood more than a dog should? The next morning, Daniel found a file in one of his father's locked drawers. Inside were documents, contracts, breeding certifications. One name came up again and again: K9 Elite Tactical Training Program, San Antonio Division, and under a picture of a German shepherd that looked exactly like Axel were the words "Sire Maximus, deceased in service, Kia." Daniel stared at it. Suddenly it made sense. These weren't just dogs, they were legacies. By the end of the week, the pups had found their rhythm, and so had Daniel. They knew the sound of his boots on the floorboards. They knew when it was time for food, time for rest, and time to play. But more than that, something deeper was forming, a connection built on more than routine. It was trust. Rusty, the brown pup, was playful and clumsy, always the first to trip over his own feet. Luna, sweet and timid, would follow Daniel around like a shadow, resting her head on his lap whenever he sat still long enough. But Axel was different. Axel didn't just follow commands, he studied them. Daniel hadn't meant to start training them, not really, but old habits are hard to kill. He'd toss a tennis ball and Axel would retrieve it with perfect focus. He'd make a sharp whistle and Axel would stop, turn and sit at attention like he'd done it 100 times before. It wasn't normal puppy behavior, not at all. That morning, Daniel decided to test a theory in the backyard. Under the wide stretch of blue sky, he set up a mock course using empty barrels, trash cans and old boxes. Nothing fancy, just something to see how the pups would respond. Rusty got distracted by a butterfly before the second turn. Luna froze halfway through, unsure and nervous. But Axel locked on to Daniel's eyes. "Stay," Daniel said. Axel sat. Axel moved down and the pup hit the ground, flat in less than a second. Daniel stared, heart thutu. He knelt beside him, placing a hand on the pup's back. "You've done this before, haven't you?" he murmured. "Or maybe it's just in your blood." Axel didn't move, didn't blink. He waited, ready. Present Daniel felt something he hadn't in years. Purpose inside. Later that day, he opened the file again. He traced the name of the sire, Maximus, a top-performing war dog who had saved 3 soldiers during an ambush in Syria before being killed in the line of duty, and now his son was sleeping under Daniel's roof. Suddenly it all made sense. The intelligence, the discipline, the fire in Axel's eyes. These pups had been bred for service, and someone had tried to erase them that night. Daniel couldn't sleep. He paced the hallway, mind racing. Why had Connor Slate, the breeder, let them go? Why tie them up? Instead of calling the program, was he hiding something? His thoughts were interrupted by a sound outside, a thud. Then another. Daniel froze. He moved to the window and saw the movement near the shed, a shadow, a figure. Someone was on the property. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed the shotgun, opened the door, and stepped onto the porch with trained silence. Moonlight lit the gravel driveway there near the tool shed. A man crouched, flashlight in hand, looking around. "Hey!" Daniel barked. The man froze, then bolted. Daniel didn't fire, but Axel did something even more shocking. The pup had run out ahead of him, barking with a deep, commanding tone. No puppy should have had. He moved fast, faster than his siblings, faster than Daniel expected, and positioned himself between Daniel and the intruder's escape path. The man tripped in surprise, landing hard in the dirt before scrambling back into his car and peeling away down the road. Daniel scooped up Axel, heart pounding. "You just held a perimeter," he whispered, stunned. "You weren't scared, you were protecting." Axel licked his chin once and then rested calmly in his arms. That was the moment Daniel knew this wasn't just a pet, this was a partner. The next morning, he made a decision. He wasn't giving them up. Not to a program, not to a shelter, and definitely not to whoever wanted them dead. Because they weren't just puppies anymore, they were his mission, and he wasn't going to fail them. Daniel had seen fear in war, real fear, but nothing rattled him like the idea that someone was willing to sneak onto his property in the dead of night for puppies. Axel's bold defense the night before had only deepened Daniel's resolve. These pups weren't just abandoned or forgotten, they were wanted, tracked, and for all the wrong reasons. At sunrise, Daniel drove into town, Axel riding quietly in the passenger seat. The pup sat tall, alert, like he belonged there, like he knew this world wasn't entirely safe and he was ready to fight for it. Daniel pulled into the gravel lot behind the sheriff's office. Sheriff Boone had known him since he was a teenager and hadn't changed much since, a stocky man with gray hair and a deep voice. Boone leaned back in his chair as Daniel walked in. "Well, if it ain't Staff Sergeant Reyes," Boone said, squinting at the dog. "That a new recruit?" Daniel gave a half smile. "I need a favor." Boone listened carefully as Daniel explained everything: the abandonment, the file he found in his father's desk, the visit from Griggs, and the shadow outside the shed. When Daniel was finished, Boone leaned forward. "You're not wrong about the program," he said. "Mump K9 Elite Tactical, it's private, well-funded, and they don't like bad press. They've had a few incidents." "What kind of incidents?" Daniel asked. "Failed litters, temperament issues. One case, 3 pups sold off too young. One turned aggressive, bit a kid." Daniel's jaw clenched. "So they cover it up?" Boone continued. "Sweep the pups under the rug, or the breeder does. Quietly, no headlines, no lawsuits. Connor Slate." Daniel said low. Boone nodded. "Yeah, that name's been on reports before. Breeds for the program, pushes the dogs hard, doesn't like questions." Daniel looked down at Axel, who was resting calmly by his boot. "He's not dangerous," he said firmly. "He's disciplined, smart, protective, and I've seen soldiers with less loyalty than him." Boone studied the pub. "He doesn't look like trouble, he's not," Daniel said. "But someone thinks he is." Boone sighed. "I can run Slate's name again, poke around, but be careful, these folks, they don't knock on doors twice." When Daniel got back home, he didn't just feel protective, he felt hunted. He reinforced the windows. He moved the pup's crate inside his own room. He kept the shotgun loaded, and within reach that evening, as he fed the pups and sat on the floor beside them, he pulled out the folder once more. Axel curled up against his leg tail, thumping lazily. Daniel traced the bloodline chart with his finger. Maximus, the sire KIA during combat in Syria, medal recipient, Delilah the dam still alive somewhere on a breeding farm owned by the program, and then he saw it, a single note at the bottom of the page, handwritten in ink, batch 099A, rejected litter, 2 unstable, destroy by end of week. Daniel's breath caught. Rejected, destroyed, that's what they were trying to do. His hand tightened on the paper. "They were never supposed to make it," he whispered, "and now someone wanted to finish what the breeder started." Daniel stood up and looked at the 3 pups. Luna was asleep on her back, dreaming paws, twitching. Rusty was chewing the edge of a couch cushion, and Axel was staring at him, waiting. "You're not rejects," Daniel said quietly. "You're fighters." He walked to the closet and pulled out a duffel bag. Army green, heavy canvas. He hadn't touched it since returning home. Inside was everything he'd left behind: training gloves, utility gear, a whistle, and a purpose. He wasn't just going to protect them, he was going to train them. Make them strong. Make them seen, because if someone wanted to erase them, they'd have to go through him first. The morning began like any other. The pups were growing stronger. Rusty had put on weight. Luna's tail wagged with more confidence. Axel, ever vigilant, had begun to respond to Daniel's voice like he'd been born for it. Daniel had built a small obstacle course on the land behind the house tunnels, made from tires, jumping bars, from scrap wood. Even a makeshift scent station using old gloves and tuna cans. What started as a simple curiosity had turned into routine. Axel was excelling his posture, his timing. His eyes locked on to Daniel's every command, with the same discipline Daniel had once drilled into soldiers. It wasn't just instinct, it was something deeper, as if Axel had chosen him, not the other way around. "Good boy," Daniel whispered. After a flawless run, Axel's tail gave a single proud thump inside the house. Daniel checked the folder again. Batch 09 and a rejected due to instability. But there had been no instability, no aggression, nothing that justified what those pups had endured. So why he was still staring at the paper when Luna began barking short, high-pitched barks, not playful, not excited warning. Daniel shot up and moved to the window. A black SUV had pulled into the dirt road leading toward the house. Not fast, not slow, just deliberate. He grabbed his shotgun and stepped onto the porch, Axel following close behind. Posture low ears, alert. The SUV stopped 20 yards away, the engine idled, then the door opened. It wasn't Griggs. A younger man stepped out, lean, sharp suit, sunglasses. He didn't smile, he didn't call out. He simply stood beside the vehicle, hands in his pockets, eyes hidden behind the dark lenses. Daniel called out, "Can I help you?" The man tilted his head. "Mr. Reyes, I believe you have something that doesn't belong to you." Daniel didn't flinch. "You've got the wrong house." "I don't think so," the man replied. "You're in possession of 3 classified breed German Shepherd's property of the K9 Elite Tactical Training Program. I'm here to collect them." "Property?" Daniel said coldly. "You mean the dung someone tied to a tree and left to die? They were scheduled for removal," the man said calmly. "It was a decision made by our director. You shouldn't have interfered. You tried to kill them. We were correcting a mistake." Daniel's knuckles whitened on the shotgun. They're not mistakes behind him. Axel stood at attention, growling low in his throat. The man gave a small nod toward the SUV. The back door opened. Another figure stepped out this time, holding a black case, the kind used for tranquilizers. Not bullets, but the message was the same. They were here to take the pups. Alive, if possible, by force. If necessary, I'm only going to say this once. Daniel said, "Get off my land." The suited man took a slow step forward. "You are a soldier, Reyes. You know how this works. Orders are orders. You think you're protecting them, but you're just delaying the inevitable." Daniel raised the shotgun an inch. "I'm not delaying anything. I'm stopping it." The man hesitated, looked at Axel. "He's already bonding," he muttered, unbelievable. And then he nodded to his partner. The man with the case began moving toward the house. Daniel didn't fire, not yet. Instead, Axel lunged like a flash of blackened muscle. He cut the space between them in seconds, placing himself directly in the man's path and barking with such ferocity that the man froze in place. The bark echoed off the hills. Luna and Rusty joined in. Smaller but just as determined, they surrounded the intruder, growling, forming a living wall between danger and home. The man holding the case backed off slowly. The leader looked at Daniel one last time, then stepped back into the SUV. Without another word, the vehicle reversed, kicked up dust and vanished down the road. Daniel's heart pounded. He knelt beside Axel and placed both hands on the dog's face. "You chose to protect them," he whispered, "just like me." That night, Daniel locked every door, but for the first time he didn't feel alone, because this wasn't just about saving puppies anymore. This was about standing up to something bigger, and for the first time in a long time, Daniel Reyes had something to fight for and someone willing to fight beside him. No more cars came, no more threats, just silence. But Daniel knew it wasn't over, so he gathered everything, the files, the proof, the photos, and handed it all to Sheriff Boone. The investigation began. Weeks later, the K9 Elite Tactical Program was exposed. Connor Slate was arrested. Justice was finally served, and the puppies, they stayed Rusty, was paired with a young boy on the autism spectrum. Luna was adopted by a retired military widow who said she hadn't smiled in years, until Luna and Axel never left Daniel's side together. They trained together, they healed now. They visited schools, veteran centers, and local shelters, reminding everyone that even the rejected deserve a second chance. When Daniel looked at Axel, now he didn't see a dog, he saw redemption.